So we can start by saying, what is personality itself? How does it relate to something called temperament? How does attachment actually interact with temperament in the formation of personality? And then how much can personality change? And what does it have to do with relationships? And what does it have to do with the brain?
Thank you to Alternatives for having organized this. And thank you to Dr. Dan Siegel for being here. We're very privileged. I've just come out of the Master's Series at Oxford where he was speaking. And I have to say he did an absolutely brilliant presentation, got a standing ovation. And a lot of people came up to him after and said, that's the best talk I've ever heard in my life. So you're in for a treat. So we're here to talk about Dan's book, which is coming out, which he did with the PDP group, which is coming out in November. It's called Personality and Wholeness in Therapy, and it's mainly for therapists. And but it's a wonderful, rich, incredible book. And it talks about patterns of developmental pathways, and about really essentially temperament, personality, attachment, and wholeness, and what that means. And this is what Dr. Siegel will be telling us, but it's really brilliant. So what I wanted to ask Dr. Siegel is, why this book? Why now? And what is the main premise? And you did an absolutely brilliant talk on it in Oxford. And, how would you sort of summarize that?
Well, first of all, thank you for being here with me, and thank you all for coming. And can you call me Dan? Would that be okay? Otherwise, I get very nervous if you call me Dr. Siegel. So how many of you are therapists? Okay, so not that many, but the therapist in your hands, the therapist raising your hands, keep your hands raised for a moment. And without really disclosing anything very personal, how many of you in your therapy training, formal training, learned a specific way of understanding what personality is and how to work with it in therapy? Keep your hand raised. Okay, so we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 people, 5. Very good. So this is an interesting finding. You have over 95% of mental health professionals who've never been told what personality is or what to do with it in therapy. Raise your hand as a therapist one more time, and let's just see so everyone can see. Raise your hand really, really high. How many learned about personality disorder? And then everyone keeps their hand raised. So this is very interesting. So what is personality? How might it be related to personality disorders is a different question, but what is personality itself? To start with, we can say that this book is trying to bring to the field of mental health a deep scientific view of what personality is for anyone, and then talk about what is the journey of personality across the lifespan really for? Why do we have personality? And then to look at what could you do personally as a therapist, it's a book for therapists, to work with your clients, with your patients, to help them turn personality from a prison into a playground, so that you may never actually get rid of personality, but you can change the way it functions in your life. So we can start by saying, what is personality itself? How does it relate to something called temperament? How does attachment actually interact with temperament in the formation of personality? And then how much can personality change? And what does it have to do with relationships? And what does it have to do with the brain? So this is why the talk I gave yesterday, I'd never given before. I'd done 4-day workshops this month, and I did 3-day workshops and 1-day workshops. But this is the first time I had to give a 1-hour talk on it. And so it was very nerve-wracking for me to figure out how to take a 20-year project and turn it into something that made any sense.
And how did this start? Because, reading it was quite interesting because you also have the whole Enneagram aspect to it. And you were very skeptical about the Enneagram.
Yeah.
And, I know that it was a sort of journey for you to get here. So can you tell us about the genesis of this project and how it happened, and how did it incorporate the Enneagram in the sort of PDP framework?
Yeah, very briefly, just to say, I'm a physician.
Yeah.
And when I was in medical school, I was very concerned about how the professors were um, not very empathic, let's just say that. And that lack of compassion got me to drop out of school. So I went on a journey to try to discover, what I wanted to do. And the time I was away, the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology was given to my professor of brain science, David Hubel, and a professor at Caltech, where I was spending my time away, named Roger Sperry. And the two Nobel Prizes were really interesting because one was for the innate characteristics of the brain and the differences between the left and right hemisphere. That's Roger Sperry. And what David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel got the Nobel Prize for in 1981 was showing that experience shapes the structure of the brain. So I decided to go back to school to finish my medical training, knowing that there were these two really distinct aspects of how the brain develops. One is innate features, another is how experience shapes the growth of the brain. So as I went through training in pediatrics, I noticed that kids had very different temperaments. And the studies were coming out of New York that the way parents tuned into the temperament of a child determined how well the kid did. So it wasn't actually the temperament, it was the relationship and the presence of that parent to say, you're my daughter, you're acting a certain way. I'm going to tune into exactly how you are and show up for you. If I have a sibling of yours, another sister or brother, I'm going to tune into him for who he is. And I will adjust my parenting according to your temperament, basically. So that always fascinated me. And when I went through pediatrics and then psychiatry and then child psychiatry and then decided to be a researcher, I became an attachment researcher, studying the disciplined way we look at parent-child relationships and how it determines the outcome for children's development. So one of the things that was really intriguing was that the best predictor of if your child was securely attached to you, which determined your child's resilience, wasn't what happened to you, but how you made sense of what happened to you. So I decided to get an NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health grant to study narratives and how the making sense process worked. And so in doing that, I was discouraged from studying attachment by the father of, modern child psychology, Jerry Kagan. He said, don't bother with that. It's all genetics, that we're going to figure out the genes and just study the genetics of temperament. And that's what you should do. And, I had a very dominating father, so I'm used to pushing away from father figures. So I said, Jerry, I'm not going to do that. And I went ahead and studied attachment. I say that because when I was learning some of the details of attachment, my hallmate in a research program we're in was Brian Vaughan. And Brian said, I'm going to show that attachment is all determined by genetics and it's all determined by temperament. And so he went on his mission to prove that temperament was the basis of attachment. And after years and years and years of trying, he wrote up, temperament does not determine attachment. So that was really interesting. So I wrote a book summarizing all that stuff called The Developing Mind. And I get a phone call a few years later from two people, a father-daughter team. David Daniels, who was a clinical professor at Stanford in psychiatry, and his daughter, Denise Daniels, had her PhD in the genetics of personality. And she had the most referred to paper on how genes influence personality with her research advisor, Robert Plomin. So they said, look, we love your book and everything. You're coming to San Francisco, come meet with us. So I had lunch with them. And they said, you left temperament out. I said, yeah, it's a book about attachment. Temperament doesn't prove anything about attachment. And they said, yeah, but do you want to learn more about temperament? And I'm always interested in learning more. So I said, sure. So they said, come for a week. And you can even be a scientist studying. We have 50 people coming from all over the world to explore this thing called the Enneagram. So I looked it up and I said, I don't think so. I'm a scientist. It's not very scientific. They go, please come as a scientist, study these people. I said, okay, fine. So I went, and it just blew my mind of these 9 particular groupings that in the Enneagram world are called types. But in academia now, especially in 70 years of looking for it, there's no such thing as a personality type. There's just personality traits that can form patterns. So that was the first thing I was very doubtful of. But anyway, the word type is used. And how many of you are familiar with the Enneagram, just so we can see? So it looks like about maybe a half, would you say, of us, something like that? So yeah, I wasn't familiar with it at all. And many therapists are not, but I was game to learning and I went there. And it really struck me that these 9 groupings called Enneagram types had some kind of validity to them. So my wonderful partner, Caroline, my wife, and I started reading David's books. And we thought it was really cool, and other people's books. And it was really useful. So I, at that meeting, was hanging around with 4 other people there who weren't in my Enneagram type, but they were in my professional type, which was a scientist. And we said, this was in 2004, you know, there must be some science beneath this thing because it looks like it's real, even though there's zero science behind it. Let's try to figure it out. So 20 years ago, David Daniels, Denise Daniels, Laura Baker, who's a professor of personality and genetics at USC, University of Southern California, and Jack Killen, who at the time was the deputy director of the Division of Alternative and Integrative Medicine at the National Institute of Health. Jack Killen and I were, the 5 of us were basically devoted to trying to figure it out. So we tried different, this view, that view, this view. David and I were clinicians. We tried out with our patients. We'd see what worked, what didn't work. And ultimately, we got rid of a lot of different efforts to try to see what the science of the Enneagram might be. And then, I edit books for the Norton series, which this is one of them. We have over 100 books in our series. 2 of those books were written by someone named Jaak Panksepp. And Jaak was, some people consider, the father of the field of affective neuroscience. So Jaak had written about subcortical networks that, for me as someone who's trained in pediatrics, seemed to be the origin of temperament. Because when you're in the utero, your subcortical areas are formed pretty much at the time of birth. And the idea of temperament is that you have some propensity of the nervous system to respond in certain ways. It's kind of like Roger Sperry's notion that left and right are fundamentally different. The same thing is true with temperament, that there's a difference we have across individuals. And you have 2 kids, I have 2 kids. Are their temperaments different?
For sure.
Yeah, and our 2 they're different too. And you see that even in identical twins. So it's not just about genetics. It's about some fundamental way, just even random ways the brain grows. And the thing that we thought was going on with the Enneagram was that you might be able to figure out some way of understanding temperament that could be underneath the way you adapt to your temperament. And when I had done attachment surveys with all those 50 people at that gathering, the initial impression, which was true clinically when I was working with my patients, was that if you had non-secure attachment, that temperament would rise into personality and become more like a prison. But if your attachment was secure, you might end up with the same personality pattern, only its configuration would be less integrative. It would be more like a prison than a playground. So then your therapy work would be not so much to change the temperament, which may not be very changeable, but to actually change the adaptive strategy that underlies personality and is intensified by insecure attachment. So that's the whole thing in a nutshell. But we're not getting into the details of the 9 patterns, but that's the broad view.
That's fascinating. And so basically what you're saying is that the temperament is something that is genetic, epigenetic, but you're not. So what are the key factors that shape temperament?
Well, the classic things in pediatrics, for example, when you do a temperament review with your families that you're working with, is, how sensitive is a child? Right. So sensitivity would be how the nervous system needs a certain amount of stimuli. So if you were a sensitive person and I went, "Hello, Kiki," you might jump at that. If you weren't very sensitive, I could say, "Hello, Kiki," and you go, "What?" Like that. So sensitivity activates the nervous system. The second feature is intensity. Once we got you triggered to respond, how big is your response? And those are separate. A third is novelty. How does a new situation activate you? Some people are fine with novelty. It's not a big deal. Some get very reactive to novelty. And a fourth feature is the tone that's created. And there are lots of others, several other aspects of temperament, but those big four, if you think about those, what we thought was happening was that these features of temperament, number one, were subcortical, and that the cortex, which is the part of the brain, if you take your hand and put your thumb in the middle, the cortex would be this higher part here. If you lift up your cortex, try it out. Go ahead. Put your thumb in the middle, put your fingers over the top. This is pretty, my daughter says, don't call this a handy model, Dad. It's a handy model. It's even your handout that Kiki and I are giving you today. And, or do you prefer Kirkland in a formal setting?
No, Kiki's great.
Sorry. That was presumptuous of me.
No, Kiki's
Okay.
perfect.
So anyway, so that's the cortex. This is going to develop later after you're born. It's not very developed at birth. If you lift up your fingers, this is the subcortical region. It has all sorts of areas. We don't need to worry about the names of the brainstem, what used to be called the limbic area. Now people say, don't call it that. So it's like the musician Prince, the area that previously used to be known as the limbic area. And then attached to all that is the spinal cord, which is coming up through the neck. That and the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, bring input from the body up into the brain and the head. And basically, the subcortical areas are very mature at birth. So they're a good place to look for temperament. Now, why is one child different from another? If you're leaning to the left, one area may grow a little bit more than the other. Leaning to the right in the womb, maybe another area is going to grow, because these are very distinct networks in the brain that we can talk about. And let's say at 1 day of age, you're a little sensitive. We're going to talk about 3 particular networks. Let's just label them A, B, C for now. Let's say network A is a little more sensitive than network B or C. Maybe it's a little more intense in its responding. Now you're a week old. After a week, neurons in that A network are now being activated more than B or C. Mm-hmm. Neurons which wire together, neurons which fire together, wire together, is what Carla Schatz said in paraphrasing Donald Hebb. No one ever gives her credit, so that's a professor at Stanford. And she did this beautiful way of showing that. And another phrase from Carla Schatz is, when you fail to sync, you fail to link. But it's this coordinated firing in that particular network that's syncing that gets them to link, right? So now you're a month old. So it started out as just a random, not necessarily genetic, not even epigenetic, but just a random thing. This is a little more sensitive. By a month, you're going to start to amplify what was an initial thing in the beginning. And now you're 4 months old. Now you're a year old. It keeps on reinforcing its own dominance in the brain. So that, we believe, is the origin of temperament.
So basically, your temperament then interacts with your experiences and your attachment experiences to then form your personality. Is that how it works?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting. You might think, and this is up for research, this is why we're so excited about this model, which we call patterns of developmental pathways. We're really excited about coming out because then researchers who can do thorough reviews, we have 600 twin pairs we're going to try to review, fraternal and paternal pairs, fraternal and identical twins. So we can see, but even that won't tell us that much, but at least we can look at this issue, because temperament can be where you have 2, as I said, identical twins with different temperaments. So they have the same genes. So you would think it might be a blend. Our theory is a little different from that. Our theory is that you have an experience in the womb that gets laid down into implicit memory, which we can talk about in a moment. But there's a feeling you have in your body, a familiarity with a sense of effortless being, just being whole, that gets embedded in the nervous system in the last trimester of pregnancy. Mm. In that state, what do you need to do to survive? Nothing. Mm. You're just being, no doing. Now, however you get out of your mother's body, and now you're out here in the world, breathing air, what do you have to do to survive?
Work.
You have to work for a living, absolutely. What happens if you don't breathe?
You die.
You die. What happens if you don't eat?
You die.
What happens if you don't have someone taking care of you and you're a mammal?
You die.
You die. So it's literally a do or die situation. So we think the do or die situation out in the world from day one is such a contrast to the implicit memory of wholeness, of this ease of being, this effortless being in the womb, that contrast activates preferentially. It looks like this, you can research this, but it looks like preferentially activates one of three, what we're going to just call subcortical motivational networks. Yeah. And this is coming from, we have about 50,000 narratives that my colleague David Daniels collected. And when we look at the narrative view, the impression we get is that there are these three fundamental ABC: agency, bonding, and certainty. But we can get into that. And that we're going to study this, but you can show how people tend to be dominant in one of those three, maybe two, but one of them usually is dominant.
Depending on their temperament?
Depending on their temperament. And hypothesis at this moment is not on their attachment.
Not on their attachment.
That's what our theory is.
But what if your experience in the womb is not that sort of sense of wholeness and, what if you suffer from trauma, or your mother's getting beaten up, or you're having a really stressful time in the womb? I mean, we know that the stress hormones and all that really impacts the embryo, right? So, or the fetus. But so what if your experience isn't, if your implicit memory is a negative one, how does that then, presuming that just feeds into your temperament?
Yeah, that would be something we would want to study and look at. And even this beginning view of what triggers one of these three vectors, we have these tens of thousands of narratives. No one's ever asked the scientific question you're asking. What would your personality be like if your mother was sadly in a situation of domestic abuse? What if she didn't want you? What if she herself was depressed during pregnancy? These are all research questions, and really good ones. And no one's ever had a framework of personality to actually dive into it and ask those questions. Mm-hmm. Clinically, as a therapist, when I dive deeply into this, now doing workshops in this, so far, even people who say that their mother had a really hard time from what their mother told them later on, they find themselves in one of these 9 patterns. So we've gotten a range of, 85 to 96% of people find themselves in one. And maybe that percentage of the people who don't, maybe it's exactly what you're saying. Maybe there's a certain percentage. But even if you had a lot of stress hormone going on, you still have this fact, even with stress, that there's nothing you have to do, and there's no separation.
That is true.
Right. So that's the thing.
And so this idea of wholeness that you talk about, personality and wholeness. So is that what you refer to, that implicit memory of being in the womb? Is that where that comes from?
Well, people use the word wholeness, and we actually resisted using it for the longest time. I mean, this is a project that's been going on for 20 years, so we're 5 scientists, and we said, whatever we're going to do, let's not use the word wholeness. It is so overused. People say it, they're not defining it. Don't use it, don't use it, don't use it. We looked at the narratives, and when people feel this sense of growth, they talk about the word wholeness. When I remember back when I was in college and worked on a suicide prevention center, one of the main things people would say when they were feeling that they had to end their lives was they just didn't feel whole. When I think about my 40 years being a therapist, that word is used all the time when people come for therapy. And when they're ready to stop therapy, they say, now I feel whole. So in the end, we decided we couldn't avoid the word. So what we do in the book is try to be super clear about what we mean about it. But just to be a little cosmic about it, before the Big Bang, 13 billion years ago, the theory goes in physics is all there was potentiality. And you would say that was kind of wholeness. And then boom, the Big Bang happens. And all this energy gets condensed into matter. that we call stars and planets and moons and your body and my body. And so now you have this experience. So maybe wholeness comes from 13 billion years ago, and we have some sense of that, like, whoa, I'm no longer just potentiality. And if you look at indigenous teachings, they talk about this feeling of wholeness across generations and with the land. Or if you look at contemplative practices, or just to look at a scientific view of meditation, I have this practice called the wheel of awareness. And when people get into pure awareness in the hub of this wheel, and we've done this with tens of thousands of people, they talk about a feeling of being complete, of feeling wholeness, of feeling love, feeling connection, feeling this joy, which is exactly what people describe in medically controlled psychedelic use. So it may be that, whether you look at psychedelic studies, or you look at, contemplative practices, or you look at people in nature, or you look at indigenous practices, or psychotherapy that is effective, people come with this sense of wholeness. This is a little bit of a diversion, but, the first book I wrote addressed the question not about personality, but about why the field of mental health never says what the mental is. They never define the mind, which is kind of weird. And then so I decided to become a researcher in the field of psychology. I'm a psychiatrist. The field of psychology doesn't define what the mind is. It describes it, doesn't define it. This was, to me, just strange. So I brought a bunch of scientists together in 1992, and I said, this is the decade of the brain. Let's ask the question, what's the connection between the mind and the brain? It's a long story, but the bottom line is the way I could get those 40 scientists to keep on coming was to offer them a definition of the mind that was dependent on a mathematical study done in the 80s, which was about complex systems. And complex systems have a process that was established in the 80s, it obviously existed forever, but they were able to clarify it scientifically, called emergence. So it's kind of like the wetness of water. If you have an H2O molecule, it's not wet, but you get a bunch of H2O molecules in your hand, and then wetness emerges from the interaction of the molecules. So what I said to the group was the mind could be an emergent property of energy. And that energy in part goes through your brain and your head, which made the neuroscientists happy. It goes through the whole body, which made the different biologists happy. It goes in our relationships, which made the anthropologist and the sociologist and those of us who do psychotherapy happy. So it basically said that your mind is an emergent process of energy flow that includes subjective experience, consciousness, information processing, and in particular, self-organizing emergent process that mathematics had shown was a part of these complex systems. I'm saying all this just to say that when I started working with this group, we were taking what I had already written about the mind, and we said, how does energy flow relate to personality? And I was already doing this wheel of awareness thing, and the experience of our minds, forget even the issue of implicit memory of wholeness in the womb, because some people find that strange and they don't want to think about it. Other people love it. So I'm just starting with that from developmentally. But let's say it's not even true. When people do meditation and get into pure awareness, instead of the mind being like a constructor of energy into information, they become more like a conduit. And what flows through them is a pure sense of what's energy flow. And when you look at what physicists say, they talk about energy moving from this kind of what I call a plane of possibility up into different degrees of probability. All that to say that wholeness is what people experience in the plane of possibility. And so for me, personality is kind of like a filter, is what I said to my colleagues, that it feels like a filter in which energy is arising from this spacious, open wholeness, and then gets filtered through the nervous system you live in, whether it's A, B, C, and then you see the variations become really interesting. And then living in a body, in a way, keeps you from that space of potentiality, which is wholeness. So personality then becomes a lifelong journey to almost getting beneath temperament.
Amazing. So the link between your patterns of developmental pathways and personality and the 9 different types. And there's an interesting correlation between the 9 different Enneagram types and your 9 patterns of developmental pathway.
Yeah.
And that's coincidental.
No,
No?
actually,
You did it.
I mean, it's consilient.
Consilient.
Consilient is a word E.O. Wilson uses, but I wouldn't even call it consilient, actually. It's not coincidental because we had David's 50,000 narratives of the Enneagram.
And
So it's not a coincidence. We were trying to make sense of why they parsed out into 9 Enneagram groupings. And was there a neuroscience? So when we present this to the Enneagram community, we thought they were going to be really angry with us. But so far, we presented to the International Enneagram Association. They were really excited that, in fact, this helps understand what their observations were. It gives a different developmental neuroscience understanding. And so far, people seem open to it.
Of the Enneagram.
No, but so it's not a coincidence.
Okay, so so you're basically showing the underpinnings of the biological and neurological development of personality, so talk us through these 3 vectors and 3 tendencies that you have used as a framework to then explain, sort of match or mirror this Enneagram, your patterns of developmental pathways.
Yes, absolutely. So, 20 years ago, we had these narratives that David had accumulated. We had our own experience. David and I were seeing patients and trying out different things. And what we noticed is that 3 major affects seemed to be a kind of go-to for people when they became reactive. So if I said to you, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Totally.
So if I said to you, and especially if it's a strange situation, but you often have to say to someone who's had a lot of therapy or done a lot of meditation, go back in time before you had a lot of therapy, a lot of meditation, and then look at what you were like, let's say, when you're in your early 20s. And it's often a different response you get. So scientifically, that's a kind of a strange situation you have to do. But anyway, that's what they do in the Enneagram world. So when you do that, I'll ask you, if you went to a party where you didn't know anybody, let's say at college, when you went into that situation, would you find yourself, wanting to make sure your fundamental needs were being met and you had a sense of autonomy and, competence, and you were, if those things weren't met, maybe you get a little irritated or frustrated or maybe even angry? Or, so that's one group. Or instead of this motivation for agency with the feeling of anger, instead you go into the party, and would it be, instead of feeling of kind of nervousness about finding people, the need for relational connection, that's just called bonding, that's the B, and you would feel a separation distress from your friends who weren't coming to the party, or sadness if someone left the party that you knew and now you didn't know anyone. Would that be your main thing? So that's B. And that's the sadness feeling and the drive for bonding. And the third one is a drive for certainty, where you want to make sure that you knew everything was going to be safe. If you could predict, you could protect, and so your experience might be anxiety or fear. So do you feel okay sharing with
totally.
the group in this private setting?
Definitely. Definitely B. So
Definitely B?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. How many of you, when you hear that question, and I know we have people in the streaming world too, how many feel like you resonate with the first one, the group A, where anger would be your thing? Raise your hand really high if you're willing to raise it. Raise a hand. Okay. How about with the B? Okay, great. How about with the C? It's fascinating. How about with 2 of them? Okay. How about with all 3? All right. So, and how about none? Okay, great. So this is kind of what you see. You see the majority, as in like 90% usually, can find 1, sometimes 2 of these. I call them vectors. And that's just interesting. It's just really interesting that people can trace this. For me, I would be in the C group for sure. And that's just interesting. I've been that way since I was young. That'd be my go-to emotional response. Now, our theory is that the distinction, and some people really don't like this, but the distinction of being away from wholeness means A, you have to work on your agency, your sense of competence. B, you need to assure your relational connections for bonding. And C, the fundamental need is for, predictability, because when there's prediction, there's protection. So, and that's the fear experience. What's interesting about these motivations, and this we were putting together in like 2007, 2008, is they matched with what you heard in the narratives, but they weren't what the Enneagram was saying, but you heard it when you tried to distinguish these different groupings. So by 2010, we published this for the first time, 2009, 2010. We published it for the first time so people could use it. Because every time we tried to publish an academic paper with this really solid kind of, in our view, theory, every time we used the Enneagram word, the academic papers, these peer-reviewed papers would say the Enneagram's not scientific. We don't publish not scientific things. And we said, well, that's why we're trying to publish in a scientific journal so someone can study it. So that's why we ultimately put it in these other, the book I wrote, The Mindful Therapist, in 2010. What's really fascinating is we got that all together. We were really, happy with that. We were accepting the rejections. And then sadly, our colleague, David Daniels, died. And so at his funeral, his colleague, Helen Palmer, said, what are you doing with this model? We said, well, we published in 2010. It's done. She goes, you have to do a more extensive summary of it, So we decided to write a book. And my colleagues kind of provided the research backup for it. And, I basically was in charge of being the main author for it. And it took 6 years to write it.
It's very dense. And so
yeah, well, it's for therapists. It's not.
It's for therapy.
I have another one coming out. It'll be with Cornerstone Press here in England, for the general public. Yeah, that'll be a totally different book.
Because it's fascinating. So you have the three vectors. So you have agency, bonding, and certainty.
Yeah.
And then you have the three tendencies.
Yes.
Which is a word that you invented.
Yeah. Well, I was so tired of typing the phrase, your primary orientation of attention. That's like, so I said, well, it's like your tendency of attention. And then I said, well, okay, that's a tendency. So that's where that word comes from. And we can see, I'll ask for you, and let's see how this works. It doesn't usually work, actually, being this simple. You have to get into more details. But some people, we noticed in the narratives, some people are just kind of inward. And this was different from introversion or extroversion. It didn't match onto that at all, which is more your sociability. You can be very inward in your energy and be very social. So it wasn't the same as that. Some people are inward. Some people are kind of outward. They enter a room, you can almost feel the energy outside their body. You know what I'm talking about? And some people are kind of this shimmering of inward and outward. We can just do a quick survey just with that one sentence view. How many, when you think about your own life, would say, yeah, I'm kind of an inward tendency. That's where I tend to be. Raise your hand really, really high. So it looks like, what would you say, about a quarter or so, maybe a third. All right, thank you. How many would say you're kind of outward, your energy is kind of outward in the world? Raise your hand really, really high. Okay, so that's much less. So that's like about 10%. And how about a shimmering between inward and outward at the same time? And looks like that's the rest of us. How many you would say, I don't relate to either of those? Okay, so that's just interesting. Kiki, what would you say about yourself?
Definitely the shimmering.
The shimmer.
And in terms of the application of what you've come up with, so these 9 different personality types, what is the point in the sense of how do you use this information? So once you've established I'm an A, i.e. I'm agency, and I'm outward, so I'm an AO, which corresponds to the Enneagram 8. Or I'm a B, bonding, outward, and therefore I'm an Enneagram 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once you've established this, how do you use it to help people? How do you use it in therapy? How do you use it as an individual?
So the whole purpose of this exercise of taking 20 years to put this model together is that in life, bless you, in life, there is a way where we believe temperament and then life experiences intensifying what we call adaptive strategies can make those adaptive strategies a prison in your life. that makes you prone to chaos and rigidity. Forget the issue of disorders. And we intentionally did not address disorders except in one sentence saying, future research could look into that. We wanted this to be a book and a framework of healthy ways of thinking about all humanity, not just people who are at an extreme. So we intentionally didn't go to disorders. And then what it means in therapy is a therapist is really going to be equipped that so far, if you believe these surveys we've been doing, the workshops, it looks like somewhere around 85 to 95% of people have a dominant one or two of these patterns. And if you've had non-secure attachment, is our theory, that pattern can be really making trouble in your life. So what therapy then can do, depending on which of the 9 patterns and the way we're trying to invite people to talk about this, first of all, is not use the word type anymore, because there's zero research. In fact, let's say it the other way. There's lots of research, so there's no such thing as a personality type. So it's good to just strike that from your vocabulary. It's hard to do because everyone says type, type, type. The difference between a pattern and a type is that pattern has a wide range of values that are changeable. It's more like a verb. When people live like a type, they say, I am an 8, and they think of it as a noun, and the noun imprisons them, ironically, in the very linguistics that you're trying to use to liberate them. So it shoves you more in a box when you make something a noun. So making it into what it really is a verb, which is a set of characteristics. So, what we do in the book and what we can talk about now is when you go through the 9 different patterns, you see that you can lead with it, is what we want people to start using that vocabulary. So I might say, I lead with a certainty dyadic, right? That means if you were my therapist, Kiki, you would know there's certain things at my growth edge that you want to help me with that are very specific to me being a certainty dyadic pattern person. That's my pattern. And if I were traumatized, so the talk you heard yesterday was all about personality and trauma, there'd be 9 ways that developmental trauma of abuse and neglect might especially affect me, because it's going to raise up that filter to become much more restrictive for me in this way where I'm questioning everything, doubting everything. This, if you look at the vector is certainty. So it means the emotion that will dominate my life is fear, right? So I did have non-secure attachment. And so I can tell you, when I was younger, especially, fear dominated my experience. Now, in the dyadic, each of the vectors has 3, right? Inward, dyadic, or outward. There's also 3 modes of the way emotion can be regulated. You can just call it a mode, means of deploying emotion. One is to upregulate. This is what the research shows in general, upregulate emotion. Another is to, instead of experiencing and expressing it as an upregulation, you are actually containing it and channeling it. That would be downregulating it. A third mechanism is to shift out of it, where you're reframing it and redirecting the energy into a totally different emotion. So what we found was that each of the vectors, agency, bonding, and certainty, had, of course, inward, dyadic, and outward. But then you have this mode that gets distributed. So in my mode, that tends to be anyone who's in this certainty dyadic is going to experience and express and upregulate the fear. If my attachment has been non-secure, which it was, I'm going to be out of control with fear. And you can ask my wonderful partner who's here about that. And I've had to work on that. Whereas someone else might get, sad and a lot of separation distress, especially if they have non-secure attachment in different ways. That'd be the bonding vector. And then the agency vector, be more prone to irritation, frustration, anger, fury, and understanding this as a couple is really, really useful. So you can understand all of that is about trying to get back to wholeness. So this is a new aspect of the model, which is that a therapist will now be given a framework to understand every single one of their clients. We think there may be a certain percentage where it doesn't apply, but the majority, let's say, of the clients, And then no matter their psychiatric, thing they present with, and if trauma's been there or any kind of non-secure attachment, which could be avoidant attachment, which is 20% of the non-clinical US population, ambivalent attachment, which is 15% of the non-clinical population, and then disorganized attachment, which is what you often see, which can be somewhere between, depending on the study, 15 and 35% of the population, sadly. That's a lot of people with non-secure attachment where their personality is going to be imprisoning them. And this would then give therapists a very specific way of whatever their, methodology is of understanding how these subcortical networks are now being amplified by adaptive strategies, which, by the way, Carol Dweck has something very similar to it, which I love this acronym she uses, called BEATS, which are beliefs, emotions, and action tendencies. I mean, you can imagine how excited I was, especially since I'm this questioning pattern where I doubt everything. When I saw her paper 5 days ago, it was like, this is fantastic. So now I love using her acronym BEATS because I couldn't figure out an acronym for adaptive strategies, So anyway, so these BEATS are your whole belief in life. For me, as a certainty dyadic, is, leading with that is like, the world is dangerous. Don't ever do anything without thinking of worst case scenario stuff. And believe me, if you're doing that all the time, even when you try to go to an airport and it's raining, you turn the car around and you don't go. Yeah. Unless you have a wonderful partner like I do who says, we can go in the rain. It's like, okay. Thank you, Caroline.
So, I mean, this is fascinating. So essentially, this is a framework for therapists to be able to really understand the temperamental sort of proclivities that have then led to the personality, which then, if it's exacerbated by trauma or by attachment issues, then becomes very detrimental to their relationships, their behavior, etc. So as an example, you take a 2 Enneagram, which is a BO in your so bonding outward. That person will be incredibly codependent, will be always trying to help other people, will be trying to look after other people's needs at the expense of their own. That's the extreme, right? So by understanding that, you then, as a therapist, can then work with your client to try and deal with, say, this is your personality pattern, or this is your pattern of developmental pathway. Right. And this is what we can do to try what you call the growth edge, to try and work with that to. Yeah. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah. And so let me build on that if I could. And if you want, we could briefly go through each of the 9 through this lens. And, my colleagues did not want to use any names because some of the Enneagram names are kind of insulting. And so we said no names. So I think we say what the names in the Enneagram world are, but we don't use them. As I've been teaching this more and speaking to my patients about it, I needed to come up with some neutral names as a clinician. The 3 colleagues are still alive. None of them are clinicians, but I needed something so people could remember more than, for example, I'm lead with BO, which also has another meaning. So you don't want to, it's not so useful. But the names I think are very neutral, and I've tested them out in workshops, and we've been playing with them. So I'm happy to share the names that'll be in the new book, Becoming Free. And so when you see each of the 9 patterns, I can give you one case example of how incredibly useful, this is in a particular clinical situation. So what I do with my patients, and this just give you the framework, is everyone gets a kind of PDP, Patterns of Developmental Pathways survey. And it doesn't take that long when you learn this mechanism to kind of figure out where someone leads with. And I've never so far had a patient that doesn't have one that they lead with. And you can say, well, that's biased. You're just totally biased. You're writing a book. Could be. So someone needs to do a general population study. But I tried out simple questions done in a questionnaire. Some of you may have been online when we did that. I don't know if any of you were, but it completely failed. So then I tried to condense the questions and make them more exacting and all this stuff. Applied it to some more people, completely failed. And then I did in workshops, to see if people did the survey, and then we spent 4 days together doing nothing but this day and night. And then we got this 96% hit rate where people could find their pattern or two, and only 50% correlated with the survey results. So all I'm going to tell you is that the same thing is true with Enneagram tests. When you go online and do an Enneagram test, there's no validity across tests.
Mm.
So be very careful about locking yourself into, no, I did that Enneagram test. So if you did my survey online and said, oh, this is my score, this is what I am, you'd be wrong. And I'm the one who created that survey based on this 20-year project. So I don't believe in surveys anymore.
Mm.
So the question is then, is there a way you can do it? And I think there is. I mean, you were at the one in Oxford where you could see the high percentage, it was in the 90s, that once we spent, that was 2 3/4 hours, the one you were at, where we could really just sit and go through each of the 9, and people would go, oh, that's me, my God. And you can see people giggling. And, when they realize, oh my God, that's my whole life you just described. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can do either way. And I can give you this clinical case because it shows how a therapist would use this. So everybody gets the PDP inquiry, and they get the adult attachment interview, which is an interview that allows you to assess as an adult what your attachment stance is. Right. It's what I've been teaching for decades,
And does that correlate? So if you've done the AAI, so the Adult Attachment Survey or
Yeah.
interview, does that correlate then? Can you then predict what the personality, the PDP is going to be?
Well, this is really interesting. In my clinical practice and in the setting of that other meeting I was mentioning from long ago, AAI insecurity versus AAI security only seems to be correlated with how imprisoning your personality pattern is, not which of the 9. So there are basically 3 forms of non-secure attachment, and there are 9 patterns. So the math doesn't even work. Each of the 9 patterns has kind of low levels of functioning, or what we call weaknesses or vulnerabilities or non-integrated states. Everybody can go there sometimes, even if you've done a lot of work, when you're tired, hungry, whatever, then there's the higher integrated state of a given pattern. So it looks like secure attachment, whether you've had it when you were a kid or you've learned it and earned it, is associated with a higher functioning. But at least our theory is, we need to do research to show this, but clinically, it feels like your attachment does not in any way predict your personality. It just predicts how imprisoning your personality is with non-secure attachment, or how liberating your personality is. And I like to, use the example you heard the other day. Like if you're going on a camping trip, you can see where if there are a bunch of you going on a camping trip, if someone is in a low state of that particular pattern would be irritating to everybody on the camping trip in a certain kind of way. But that same pattern, when it's in a higher state, would be really welcome to the whole camping team.
And when you talk about low states and high states, do you mean of integration? Because you talk a lot about integration. So what do you mean by integration? And you correlate integration with wholeness, or you talk about the link between wholeness and integration. Can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between wholeness and integration? And integration is sort of in some ways the holy grail.
I'm trying to be so careful, Kiki, because I'm kind of a nerd. And so since I wrote a 500-page book on this one question you're asking, I'm trying to condense 500 pages into like a paragraph to you. So I'll just try to highlight it. Number one, you always want to be careful saying every, but we couldn't find any exceptions to this. Every form of mental suffering seems to present as either chaos, rigidity, or both. So that's one observation. When you ask the question, the scientific question, what do we know that makes a system either be chaotic or rigid, or it's like a river, or it's flowing in a state of wholeness and harmony in the middle of that river, and one bank is chaos, one bank is rigidity? What do we know? And the only place that can get a deep scientific discussion of that is mathematics. And the mathematics of what's called complex systems, I'm not going to get into that here, but shows that when you differentiate aspects of a complex system, allow them to be different, honor differences, cultivate differences. That's called differentiation. So differentiation, when you balance differentiation with linkage, linkage means connecting, where in the connection, you don't lose the differentiated essence. Like when you walk with your left and right leg, if they were just differentiated and not linked, you'd just be falling over the place. If they were linked but not differentiation, you'd just be hopping. So this beautiful thing we call walking or running or dancing or all those things means you're differentiating and linking your left and right legs, just to give you an example. So what the science of complexity says is that optimal self-organization, the way a complex system regulates its own unfolding, happens when you balance differentiation and linkage. So if you look at any example, let's say someone with bipolar disorder, we don't think it's caused by experience. We think you inherit it. It has a high genetic loading. And when you look in the brain of people with bipolar disorder, there's impaired integration. So it's not from experience. If you look at Marty Teicher's work at McLean Hospital in Harvard, I went for a long walk with Marty in Australia, and I said, what's the bottom line? And what he says is that when you look at developmental trauma, which is neglect and abuse, the bottom line is integration is impaired in the brain, the way we're defining integration. You can see that in the prefrontal cortex, the corpus callosum, the hippocampus, and the connectome. These are all, for anyone interested in the details, we don't need to get into it, but the way differentiated areas in the brain are linked is compromised. And Marty Teicher just came out with a study with Sarah Lazar that shows you can take people with high adversity in childhood who have impaired integration in their brain, and you can show growth of these very same integrated fibers with mindfulness interventions. So that was just published. So it's an exciting time to say that integration, linking differentiated aspects of a complex system, seems to be the basis of health. Smith et al. In 2015 published a paper showing every measure of well-being they could find was predicted by how interconnected the connectome was, which means how you link differentiated areas. And that's one of the ways we study mindfulness interventions. And the connectome is less connected after developmental trauma. So the great news is you can learn an intervention. And it isn't just talking therapy. It's a deep intervention that opens up neuroplasticity, that allows you to make these differentiated areas more differentiated and then link them in ways that promote this, flow of harmony. And yeah, there's another layer of that would say that is when you start feeling whole. You feel coherent. You feel like grounded and rooted. You feel like things are going in this sense of flourishing.
And so the way to get to that state, you talk about you mentioned that there's a study with talk therapy that helps that, but also mindfulness. So Marty Teicher's work with mindfulness, that's fascinating. And presumably psychedelics as well will, increase this integration, I would imagine.
Well, it's an honor to have Bessel van der Kolk here in the thing. Bessel could probably respond to this. I think one thing we think happens with psychedelics is they drop people out of these fixed ways of being and they open up neuroplasticity potential. Mm-hmm. So it isn't just that you go to a party and take psychedelics. It's you need to do the integrative therapeutic work using psychedelics to drop you out of these, I call them plateaus, these plateaus of rigid ways the brain has been committed to post-trauma or depression or panic about dying. And you drop into what I call a plane of possibilities in my theory that corresponds to what Robin Carhart Harris speaks about the entropic brain hypothesis. But basically, yeah, you are allowing the brain to have different possibilities of the way it's having its probability sets created, because the brain is basically a probability machine.
And linking that back to your theory about the personalities, and you talk about so the states of low integration and high integration. So low integration are the more dysfunctional aspects of these personality manifestations. Is that correct? And
yeah.
then the higher integration are the healthier ones. And so just to go back to, so the theory is that attachment and attachment wounds and trauma really makes these personality patterns much more rigid, either rigid or chaotic, less integrated, so lower integration. And so the whole point is to work with these to increase levels of integration, to have higher integration, and to have less of these extremes between rigidity and chaos.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And when you see this grid, I call a personality palette, you would then address exactly what you said with the specificity of saying, how do I help myself? This is about your own life? Or how do I help a client then move within a given pattern? So for me, as a certainty dyadic leading pattern, what I need to do in a non-integrative state is realize, wow, I am consumed with fear. I'm doing worst case scenario thinking. I'm doubting everything. I'm questioning everything. And I'm paralyzed by my doubt. And why is that not integrated? Why is that so rigid? Why is that chaotic with worry? I wake up at 4 a.m. worrying. It's non-integrated because I'm not opening to the idea that the world is actually a very uncertain place. And I can learn to feel this sense of trust in the world. And when I do this thing called the wheel of awareness practice, I can get into that hub of the wheel, pure awareness, where I begin to get beneath all of my cortical thinking, right? And not take it so seriously, basically. So in a higher integrated state, I can say, okay, I've got a propensity. Let's talk about that vector. In the certainty vector, I have a propensity to question everything. So I once wrote an entire book called Mind, which was an entire book of questions. I was so happy. That would be an example of, I hope, a higher integrated state. I produce a book questioning. I, in that same vector, can go from that questioning pattern where I'm dyadic. I say, let me go really inward, and I become more like leading with, I lean into this preparing pattern. So I'm preparing the book. When I wrote this book, I had to be super in preparing pattern. Or I can move over to the outward form of this same vector of certainty, and I become seeking. So I seek other projects, other things I'm doing, this kind of thing. So each of them has a higher state of functioning that's very useful in the world. In this case, for that vector, in this order, it's preparing, questioning, and seeking. And that being my vector baseline, I can easily go between them. But sometimes, I'll give you just that clinical example if you want. I have someone who's having serious relational issues where he, was connected to his partner, and the partner turned out not to do what he needed to be done. It's a complicated story. So what he did is he lives usually leading with an immersing pattern, which is the bonding inward, brings this beautiful way of being immersed in stuff. And now, as this threat is happening, he takes his inward thing and goes outward to exactly where you're talking about. And he moves over to this bonding outward, which is caregiving pattern. And he completely goes to the low level of functioning in that state. He's still in the same vector, this motivational set that he has from his, subcortical circuits. But now he's losing himself completely and taking care of his partner. Right. And so what we do is we point out, that he's still in the same vector, but what he really needs to do is work on his attachment security, so he can actually find this grounding and go where his baseline appears to be, feel his feelings fully, and not let them overwhelm him, which would be the non-integrated state of the immersing pattern, the bonding inward, and allow him to fluidly go not only in that state of enjoying the fullness of his emotional life, but also be able to tap into not just the ones in his vector, but tap into all the other patterns. And when you hear all 9, you realize everybody can literally differentiate these 9 and access them. And so that's what integration also means. It's not just in your own pattern, but you can access the higher states of each of the other 8.
And so that, in a nutshell, I guess, is how you go from a prison to a playground, is what you were describing.
Yeah.
And that's the aim, is to use this so that you can get away from the rigidity of these patterns and move along the different, tendencies and
Exactly.
move along the different vectors.
Along the vectors. And when you see the grid that you were working with the other day, it's actually really fun. The last thing I'll just say is what's so exciting to me about this for the field of mental health is I mean, we not only now have a definition of the mind that can help us understand what mental health is based on, which is exciting, but now we can look at this whole idea of personality and see how our challenges in life intensify those and actually have a framework for working with it. I think it's worth saying, and I wrote a book called Interconnected about this, you know, that it isn't just developmental trauma. I mean, it isn't just the trauma of attachment issues not going well, but in some ways, living in modern society is traumatizing.
Very.
Because we're getting a message in all sorts of ways, certainly from our parents. We get it in school, we get it when we get on the job, you hear it in the media, including social media. We're getting a message that the self is the individual. And since most of us are probably in modern culture and not living in indigenous land-based cultures here, you know, you may say, well, isn't that obvious? The self is the individual. But what I want to have you consider that if self, and this is a deep review of the science of self, if self is a center of experience, then there's no reason it needs to be limited to your skin encased body. So when people in modern culture are told that who you are is just this person in a body, you try to live with that belief system. But it is a violation to what's called epistemic trust. So epistemology is how we come to know what we know. And when people in authority tell us stuff that's nonsense, you know, that's called a violation of epistemic trust. We have that in the United States now in all sorts of ways. So when you actually take a look at this incredible trauma, the epistemic trust is being violated, it's probably intensifying these personality patterns. And that's even if your parents were giving you the most amazing secure attachment in the world. Living in modern culture is really, really tough. And with a lie like this, we have the opportunity to say, whether it's about systemic racism and social injustice, be one example of the outcome of that, or the way we're destroying our natural environment because we've excessively differentiated even our human species from non-human species. All these things are creating unhealth in the world. So we can't just think about this, oh, this is just a personality system. But when you get to the end of this book, and we had big debates among the living authors about this, I actually wanted to put this in the beginning, but they said, no, don't put it in the book. I said, well, let's at least wait till the end. But there's a deep dive you can take into what identity is all about that lets you say you're not just a me, but who you are, yourself, is also a we, that it's relational. And then one way to integrate that is this goofy word, you know, me plus we is mui. So in the ultimate thing of looking at personality, and this is going to sound totally paradoxical, the ultimate growth work of working with your personality is actually to not take it so seriously or take it so personally and actually drop beneath it to this layer of open awareness that lets you experience that, in fact, your personality was just a filter trying to help you live in a world that is filled with lies. Yeah. And when you get to a deeper truth, you're actually freeing yourself up, not from your temperament, because your temperament is probably just the way your subcortical networks are having a propensity, and that probably you always have, but you don't have to take it so seriously. And then, as my 95-year-old mother learned how to be mindful with Caroline Welch, my partner's book, The Gift of Presence, great book, Mindfulness Guide for Women. And she learned from me with the Wheel of Awareness. So she was with Caroline and me one day, and she said, I think I figured out what you guys are teaching me about mindfulness. We said, great, Sue, what'd you learn? She goes, mindfulness is when what used to annoy you now amuses you. So that's exactly, from Sue Siegel, that's exactly what it means to make personality go from, you know, this prison that is really annoying you and constraining you, and you take it so seriously, you know, to a playground that amuses you. And then you even drop beneath that. So I know it's strange to spend 20 years trying to put together a model of personality and say, hey, your real home base is actually beneath any of that personality stuff. So in the book, I was very careful to say, these patterns you lead with are your baseline. And I don't use the word home base. And I say your real home base is pure awareness that makes you realize we are all connected. It's kind of like the Pandopopulous forest in Utah in the United States, which is a forest where there are 48,000 seemingly separate quaking aspen trees. But when you go 6 inches beneath the surface of the soil, you find it's one root ball. And when you test the DNA of this grove, it's basically exactly the same tree. It's amongst the largest and oldest living things on earth. So Pandopopulous is a beautiful living example of a metaphor that these bodies you're all in, and everyone listening out there, they're just manifestations of the same essence that comes from pure awareness. So when we do, this journey into personality in these workshops, I always do the wheel of awareness practice. People get into the hub of pure awareness versus the thing they're aware of on the rim. And the rim is where your personality lies. The hub is where the real truth of our deep connection as a we rests. So that's kind of the ultimate message.
That's very beautiful, I have to say. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. That was really, really fascinating. And I think this book and the next one for lay people is going to be absolutely fascinating.